Today is March 11th, 2024, and I am joined by Kim O'Connell on StreamYard. My name is Laura Stoner, and I work at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. We also have Paige Newman and Dr. Emily Raymond here in the interview, and we're asking Kim about her life with a Vietnamese mother and a father who was in the military, and just your whole experience of this life. So let's start with, when were you born?
I was born in November of 1969.
Okay.
Just made it into the 60s.
And um, what is your full name?
Kim Ann O'Connell.
And where were you born?
I was born in Ithaca, New York.
And who were your parents?
My parents were my father was Dennis Michael O'Connell, and my mother was her maiden name is Hung T. Win, but she
Mhm.
was known and still is known as Hung T. O'Connell.
And where were your parents born?
My father was born in Madison, Wisconsin. Um, very Midwestern upbringing. And my mother was born in what was then a small town outside of the former Saigon called Bien Hoa, which is now a very bustling part of the major metropolis of Ho Chi Minh City. But back when she was born in 1941, it was, as she tells it, a rather small, kind of mostly rural place that's really been developed over the last century, basically.
And your mom is still living, but your
Yes.
dad has passed away.
Yes. My father died in 2010.
And so how did your dad get into the military?
Well, he chose to join the Army in the early 60s. He graduated from college, University of Wisconsin, I believe, in 1963. And he was very inspired by the sort of service that President Kennedy was encouraging people to do. And he felt that the military was a good way to sort of kick off his career and, serve his country. He knew that there was sort of growing discontent in Southeast Asia, and he was interested in intelligence and things in international relations. So after he graduated from college, or from undergrad, I should say, he decided to join the Army. And so he joined the Army, and he knew it wasn't going to be a lifelong career, but it was something that he wanted to do at least for a while. He ultimately served, I believe, 4 years in the Army before he then became a civilian and worked for the federal government for the rest of his life, from or until he retired. Yeah, so then he was pretty quickly put into intelligence issues, and he was sent overseas fairly early in the Vietnam War period, long before that we had lots of troops on the ground. So I believe my dad was there by January of 1964.
And had he done ROTC, or did he like
Yeah.
go in and okay, so
Yes.
he done.
Yeah, he had done some ROTC in college at the University of Wisconsin, I believe.
So he was an officer as
Yes. Yeah,
and not enlisted.
he was a captain in the Army,
Mhm.
was his ultimate title, and didn't progress beyond that, but yes, he was an officer.
And so he met your mother while he was in Japan. So was he deployed to Vietnam and then go to Japan, or did he
Yeah,
go
so
to?
he was deployed to the Okinawa Army base, which I think was primarily Army back then, on Okinawa, Japan, which was kind of a major base of operations for U.S. troops um, during the war. And so, he was in Vietnam a few times during his tour of service, for various reasons, but mostly spent his time on Okinawa. And
Mhm.
my mother, who had, gone all the way through university and had a proficiency for language, had actually gotten herself hired by the War Department, by the U.S. Army, to teach Vietnamese to American soldiers. So she was also stationed on Okinawa as a civilian, but as someone who was teaching Vietnamese to American soldiers. And my dad was in her class. So, and as he used to put it, that basically all the young men in the class were hitting on my mother and trying to offer to take her home on base or take her out for coffee. And he was one of the lucky ones, I guess, because she actually said yes to him. So when he asked, and they dated for a while and they had kind of a whirlwind romance. And then they did get married on Okinawa in 1966.
So how did your mother's family view her and her education and like going off to live on her own in Japan? And was that viewed as like she was getting opportunity to grow as a person, or like were they concerned? Were they happy that she wasn't in Vietnam?
I have to guess at some of these answers because my mother has never, ever really been one to talk too much about her family, and she's pretty tight lipped about memories and things like that. So it's been one of the challenges of my life to try and get those kinds of answers. But to the extent that I can understand it, I do think that they were really, anxious and excited for her to have opportunities that would get her kind of out of, you know, their village, basically, where it was kind of a lot of hand to mouth existence. My mother said that when she was very, very young, like she even lived in a house that had a packed dirt floor. And so they didn't have a lot of money, and that things did get better. My mother was the oldest, so seen as, the one that sort of had to carry a greater burden than the younger siblings. So they did put a lot of emphasis on her achievement and her academics. And she was a very good student. And like I said, she just had this natural affinity for language, something I envy because I've never had that. But she at a time could like speak up to 5 languages, I believe. She just had a great affinity for it. And so she went to University of Saigon, and they were excited about that. And I do think that there was an idea that, maybe if you join the army, you'll meet, a rich American soldier and your life will improve from there. So I do think there was pretty broad support in her family for her education, and then to, find a life partner that could be seen as taking her out of, a more limited environment.
Hmm. Did did she help? Was there ever a thought of bringing her family members to the United States?
Yeah, so there was, she was raised by her stepfather. Her parents split up, and I think her biological dad kind of took off and was not a presence in her family growing up. So she had two um, sort of half brother and half sister growing up, and she and my dad did were involved in sponsoring those two and bringing them over after the war. So that was quite a bit after that was after the fall of Saigon. So that was in the late 70s that
Hmm.
that happened. So my mother had been here as the only member of her family for quite a while because they were back in the States, I believe, by 67 sometime in
Hmm.
1967 they were back. He was done with his duty to the army and they were living in the United States.
Kim, what kind of wedding did they have? Did they have a military wedding or a traditional Vietnamese wedding, or
It
did
was
they?
it was a beautiful wedding from what I can tell. I have a lot of pictures from their wedding, and it was on base at the Okinawa base, which was very customary at the time. He had the full thing where my dad was in full, white army dress uniform, but my mother did wear this very beautiful traditional white Vietnamese wedding dress. But beyond that, I don't get the sense that it was like an Asian wedding per se. It seemed like a very westernized kind of wedding with the full tiered wedding cake and attendance and the whole thing. And I know that they did the Arch of Swords for my parents when they walked out. Some of his, I guess, army colleagues had lined up with swords and they walked under that. It's a beautiful picture. And so they had a very traditional looking wedding. I think I still have a guest book or things like that. It seemed, lots of
Hmm.
wishing cards and things like that. They seemed very pretty. They got married there.
Was her family able to attend?
To the extent that I can tell, I don't feel like she had family members there, and I'm not really sure why. Probably just expense or expedience. I don't know. I really don't know why, but it doesn't seem that. I mean, she had lots of friends because she was far from the only Vietnamese person who was hired and who worked on base. So they had a lot of Vietnamese people and friends at their wedding, but I don't get the sense and have never heard that any member of her family was able to be there.
Um, So they get married and then they go back to the States.
Hmm.
And your mom has to undertake becoming a citizen because she's
Yes.
um how long did that take?
It took about 3 years, and I'm not sure if that was because of any bureaucracy or problems that they had, or whether it was just kind of busy life circumstances. Because pretty soon after they got back to the States and settled back here, my dad applied and got into Cornell Law School because he knew he wanted to be a lawyer, and he wanted to be a practicing lawyer and work for the government and work in international relations. So he got into Cornell Law, which is what moved them to Ithaca, New York.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I know they lived in San Francisco for a while. I'm not super clear on what their pit stops were before Ithaca. I'm a little unclear on that, but I know that by 69, they were in Ithaca, so my dad could attend law school. And and that's where I was born. So I was born in November of 1969. And then my mother, once they were, I guess, more settled, that they knew that they would be in Ithaca for a couple years while he finished law school. She did get her citizenship while in Ithaca, New York. So I have a great picture of them because the I guess the local newspaper would regularly write up, citizenship ceremonies. But for some reason, he picked a picture of my parents to put as the photo for the article. So I have a great photo of them standing on the courthouse steps. I think my mother is even holding like a little American flag right after she became a U.S. citizen, which
Yeah,
is pretty cool.
I saw it online and they just look like they're looking out into a bright future.
That's what I always think about it. It's a very beautiful picture and it's a treasure. I have the original crumbly yellow newspaper and lots of copies that I hope to pass down to my kids someday. And it's really exciting.
Did you I don't know if you ever had a discussion like this, but you said your dad was very idealistic when he went into the military. Did his experiences in serving in Vietnam and Okinawa and then being with your mother who is a Vietnamese person and has been subject to the tumultuous history of her country
Hmm.
change any of his perspectives on what was going on there and the American involvement and anything like that?
I mean, that's a great question, but my sense, no, my dad was pretty idealistic his whole life. He had dark moments, like I think everybody does, but he got, all through the 60s, through Lyndon Johnson's administration, my dad was very pro civil rights legislation and, equal rights amendment. He was very, liberal minded and very idealistic about our capability as a country to do good things and make the world a better place. And I think he did really believe that, our military was a key part of that. It was part of making the world a better place. So he always had that kind of what I consider like a Midwestern idealism about
Hmm.
him that was very infectious and great. He did sometimes get demoralized the older he got. That's more recent. Like I know that more towards the end of his life, all the mass violence, mass shootings, he was
Hmm.
very disheartened by that. He got to the point where he just didn't want to hear about that anymore. So I know that there were things that did make him feel dejected about the state of our world sometimes, but overall, he was a pretty idealistic guy, and he remained so even after the war.
How did his parents feel about his marriage? Um, because it was considered, interracial at the time.
Mhm.
Was there any pushback from Wisconsin people?
Um, I think there was some animosity about it from his mother, mostly. He came from a really liberal-minded family, a larger family, and I don't think that people really looked askance. I don't know what their private feelings were, but
Mhm.
he never felt unwelcome. My mother didn't feel unwelcome by my dad's family. My paternal grandparents, so I never knew my paternal grandfather, my dad's father, because he passed away while my dad was in service in the army. He died which was a really tragic thing. And I sometimes do wonder whether my dad felt an urge to get married, to get settled, because he'd had this big rupture in his
Mhm.
family where his parents had already split and then his dad passed away unexpectedly at a pretty young age. I do know that his mother, my paternal grandmother, was not super pleased that he married an Asian lady. I think she had a vision of him settling down in the Midwest with someone that she would have been more familiar with, probably a white lady, little mild-mannered white person, so from the Midwest. So, but my grandmother had mental illness too, so that I think factored into some of her animosities, that she just had a lot of unsettled feelings because she had a lot of mental illness, and that was a challenge for my dad. So some of that might have been personal against my mother, and some of that just might have been like she just was kind of antagonistic at times
Mhm.
to my dad. So I don't know whether she might have acted that way towards anyone he married. I really don't know.
Yeah. Um, did your mom ever think about working after she got married to your dad, or was it just, the social conventions of the time dictated that she didn't
My
that
mother worked my mother worked the whole time she lived in America,
Oh,
and
okay.
my mother didn't stop working until the pandemic. She
Oh.
was in her 80s, and one of the major things that, I helped her with during the pandemic was to finally get her retired because she was the oldest person still working. She was interested in library science, so
Uh-huh.
I don't think she worked right away, mostly because my dad helped to fund her to get, she never actually finished her master's, and I have a feeling that, like, having a second child, my younger brother, had something to do with it because the timing kinda lines up, but she got all the way through almost a full master's degree in library science from the University of Maryland, and I
Oh.
remember this because, this is, after l Cornell Law School. My dad moved to the greater DC area, and I grew up in College Park, Maryland, and so the university is right there, and so my dad did support fully that my mother could have a career here, and helped fund for her to go get this, at least many, many credits toward a master's degree in library science. She got far enough that she was hired by the Library of Congress to work for them as a lower level cataloger, even without the master's in library science, and that is where she remained. She worked for the Library of Congress for almost 50 years until she retired in the pandemic. So there was a lot of support in my family for her working, and I never knew her to not work, actually. So um, it was pretty groundbreaking, I guess, and pretty awesome. And she again had this such a proficiency with language. So to be able to like catalog, international works, books, and then she spent the bulk of the more advanced part of her career as she progressed up the ranks. She worked in the
Hmm.
rare
Mhm.
maps division for the Library of Congress, and helped to catalog really complicated international maps of places you would never have heard of. And so she was pretty quite accomplished
Paige and I
in her
have
career.
cataloged Paige and I have cataloged maps, and it's no fun. It takes a special person to catalog maps, and then, like, even more complicated maps in different languages. My
Yes.
hat tip to your mom.
Yeah, no, it's pretty it was a pretty amazing career, and I remember it was a very emotional day for both of us the last time, she had to this was during the height of the pandemic. We had to go down to the Library of Congress and, like, close out all her stuff, and it was quite emotional for her. So
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, that I'm glad that she got to do something that used her language and, like, um, seemed to that she could do for a lifetime.
mhm. Yeah, no, and definitely, and then at least, I don't know how it is now, but back then, if you worked for the federal government, you were, really set for life with really good sort of retirement benefit package and great, benefits. And so she really did do well for herself, and that can be comfortable now because she worked for a really long time for the library, and it has served her well.
Mhm. Okay, so you were born, and then how many years was it till your brother was born?
My brother was born on May 1st, 1975. And that date is important because he was born the day after the fall of Saigon.
Mhm.
So it's just a weird way history lines up, because my mother always talked about how it was like this joyous moment and like the saddest thing ever, because even though she had opted to leave Vietnam and start a new life in the US, she still wanted South Vietnam to continue as a country. She didn't want her homeland to lose this war. They've been following the war really closely. And so when Saigon fell, it was devastating for her, even after many years of having lived there, and then to have this thing where she was actually in the hospital. She was already in the hospital awaiting the birth of my brother. And she says that, and my brother has had some issues and problems in his life. And my mother, who's very superstitious, thinks, well, it's probably because I cried so much when he was born.
Mm,
So it's pretty sad, but, but she certainly had a new life, here. And my brother was born and it's just the two of us, me and my brother, in terms of siblings.
yeah. Um, was she trying to, what did she try to teach you as you were growing up about her culture?
Well, she didn't try to teach me too many things about the culture, but the way she expressed her cultural heritage most was through food. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what I remember most about learning about my Vietnamese heritage was just the Vietnamese dishes that she made, mostly spring rolls. We made those a lot and other Vietnamese dishes. So this was the 70s, and being Americanized was a very big deal for immigrants during that time. I don't think our differences were, celebrated as much as they are now in terms of like, understanding that, kids can be, have bilingual and have, be able to hold multiple, traditions in their family and celebrate their heritage. My mother was very big on becoming Americanized, and she used that phrase a lot. So she only spoke English at home with us. I never learned Vietnamese growing up. She tried to make us very American food. She tried to assimilate as much as possible and, let us be normal American kids, in her view. So I don't feel like I did get taught very much about her culture. And it was only really until I became an adult that I started digging into this myself. It wasn't because really a lot that my mother was trying to get me to understand anything in particular. It was just kind of left off the
Hmm.
page for the most part.
I read an article where you were talking about your mom making, because I think she's Buddhist, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Lightly.
she was making an offering of a duck. And so I didn't know how religion worked in your family between your two parents, if
Hmm.
she Americanized and, kind of put it aside, or if it came out in different times where she wanted to celebrate it.
Hmm. It's interesting because in a way, religion in my family was kind of performative. It was sort of something my dad used to use the phrase all the time, cultural literacy. He said we were doing things for cultural literacy, not because I really believe all this stuff. My dad was pretty agnostic, didn't believe in Christianity, and just wasn't in for all that stuff. Yet he said, well, for cultural literacy, you ought to know what to do when you go to church. You ought to know what the Lord's Prayer is. So we would go to church, especially on the high Christian holidays. And we certainly celebrated Christmas and Easter. And I got gigantic, Easter baskets and stuff. But it wasn't like because my dad really believed in the whole story of Christianity. So that was sort of just, his way of having it be present, the fun parts of it. I don't think he believed in it deeply. And so I had a very light relationship with religion and with Christianity. And then there was my mother who practices Buddhism, but sort of like when she feels like it, when she feels particularly moved by it. So for me, like religion was not a major part of my upbringing.
Hmm.
And it felt very distinct and separate because, which I'm sure we'll get to, like my parents split up when I was 7 years old. So I also think of their practices as very separate,
Mm.
and being raised, having these two separate kind of expressions of religion that were sort of like, just almost like a buffet to pick and use when you really needed it, but not something that was practiced very devoutly by either
Uh,
one of them.
that's I think a lot of people have that experience with religion these days.
Yeah.
Um, I also, switching gears, you also mentioned that there was a neighborhood boy who would drive by your house on his bike and call you VC.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, and it also must have been strange for you because you write about how you and your mother didn't look like each other,
Mm-mm.
and
Yeah.
so Um, so to me, that would just be such a clash right there of like, I am, but I'm not, kind of feeling.
Yep, that's the story of my life, basically. um, yeah, it was very weird. I remember that kid. The kid that used to call us that name,
He's meaning Viet Cong.
Viet Cong, VC meaning Viet Cong, which was a fairly common slur at the time, against Vietnamese, and it's just incredibly ignorant too because it was, the other side pretty much. But that kid grew up to then ask me to the prom in high school, and I was like, "No, I'm not going to the prom with you." Like, it's just funny. He clearly had no memory of any, and to be fair, like, he was just a kid, and if I had to guess, he was parroting probably what his parents were saying about my family
Yeah,
behind their back, like, because he was only like 2 years ahead of me, like, I'm sure he didn't really know what he was saying, but and that's really the only instance I remember to my face. I was with my mom a couple times when people were rude or said slurs to her, like in the grocery store, in a mall. I remember a couple of those instances. I don't remember a lot of overt racism against her, but it's also not like she had a lot of friends and was, invited to all the neighborhood parties or anything. So I can only guess what extent her race had to do with any of that, or just also lots of lingering bad feelings about the Vietnam War in general. So, you know, um, as I'm sure your exhibit will talk about, there's just so much hard feelings about the cost of the war. And so like it was just an unhappy kind of situation to be in, to have my dad have brought this like living, breathing emblem of the Vietnam War and all that that came with to this otherwise totally white middle class neighborhood. And I'm sure people did talk about us behind our backs. So anyway, I feel like I stepped on your question a little bit, but I do remember that incident with that boy and feeling very much like what? And I remember asking my dad. Actually, this is making me recall that I remember saying, "What does he mean by that? Like, what is he talking about?" And my
mhm,
dad having to sort of gently explain to me what the term meant and how he was using it as kind of like a slur to make us feel bad or make us feel different.
mm,
And it was weird because I look just like my father. So, I was just another white kid, but it just goes to show how powerful racism really is. It doesn't even matter. They're really not seeing you. They just see the race and they just want to knock it down.
yeah.
So,
We interviewed a participant whose family had been a boat family, and she went to school and she was in high school in the 90s, and they had discussed the Vietnam War in class. And one of her classmates had said they should have just dropped the bomb.
mm,
And she was like, you're basically like that broke her heart because it was like he wanted to eradicate her whole country.
mhm.
And I don't know that like, maybe it's like America and our, lack of geographic knowledge, but that he knew that he was saying didn't know that that would be so hurtful to her. But
Mhm.
it was a very like tense moment in the interview, like where she was kind of recalling that hurt. Um,
Oh yeah. It's so easy to dehumanize other people. I mean, we see it every day.
mhm.
And so if you don't see people as humans, then you can say anything because, I don't know, that's terrible.
Did have you ever encountered, this is kind of a random question, but like the North and the South Vietnamese, when you come to America, you're just Vietnamese,
Mhm.
but within your own community, the Vietnamese community, like there's probably still tensions between the North and the South.
Mhm.
How do you how do Vietnamese people deal with that in America where you're divorced from the conflict that is um, territorial, in Vietnam?
Well, to the extent that I know about it, because this is more about stuff that I've learned as an adult, as I've researched some of this stuff more than my own personal experience. Because when I was growing up, I wasn't around very many
Hmm.
Vietnamese people to have some of those kind of potential conflicts come up. But as an adult, this is definitely something that's still the case with the oldest generation, the former refugees, the people that came over right after the war. There's still a big north south divide. my sense now from work I've done and just talking with younger generation of Vietnamese Americans and also Vietnamese, from Vietnam, is that because it's been a unified country for fairly, for decades now, that there isn't as much of a divide between North and South. That now, like if you talk to a Vietnamese person and treated them as Vietnamese, kind of, in that national sense, people wouldn't really blink an eye, I don't think, because time really, changes things fairly quickly. And even though, like, for some of us who have some memories of the fall of Saigon and can kind of have a tie to the Vietnam War, like for the younger generation, that's all history book stuff. So they just don't feel it as strongly. And I know that's true in the younger generation now. And in fact, in terms of how sort of cultural heritage is displayed in the United States, like places like the Eden Center, the Vietnamese
Mhm.
community in Falls Church near me, and in Orange County, California, and other places, it's very common to fly the former flag of South Vietnam, the yellow flag with the three red horizontal stripes. And the younger generation is like, why are you, they'll say like, why are you still flying this old flag that has no connection to Vietnam or to the Vietnam of now? So it's increasingly seen as an old issue, which
Mhm.
I think has pros and cons. It's probably has good and bad sides. One interesting, very personal story, though, is that I guess about 8 or 10 years ago, I made a half-hearted attempt to try belatedly to learn Vietnamese
Mhm.
because I hadn't been taught it when I was a kid. And just because I had been doing more research into this community, and I thought it'd be another way to feel more connected to that side of my heritage and maybe talk with people I was interviewing. And it kind of went nowhere. It's a very difficult language. And, reaching the half century mark, it was just like hard for my brain. And I don't have what my mother's gift was, which was to be able to pick up languages. So, but I did valiantly go through a few lessons, a few Vietnamese lessons. With a wonderful patient young teacher. But because she was young, she was a Vietnamese immigrant. Like she was a Vietnamese American who had come from Vietnam. So she was born there and then came to America. But she was relatively young, probably maybe 25 years younger than me. And she spoke with what was then known as a North Vietnamese accent, which I think now is just a Vietnamese accent.
Mhm.
I know there's dialectical changes between parts of the country, but there's a certain way of speaking that was once considered North Vietnamese with certain ways of pronouncing different consonants. So when I went to my mother and said, "Look, I'm learning Vietnamese," and she would say, "Okay, count to 20 or say this or say that." And as soon as I started talking, she said, "You're talking with a North Vietnamese accent. This is North Vietnamese." And she just didn't want to hear anymore. And I was like, "Oh, ooh, I didn't even think about that." Like, it just hadn't occurred to me that this is what this younger Vietnamese teacher would have been speaking, but that's all, that's kind of what all they know now,
Mhm.
So I think it's complicated. Every passing generation might be changing that. I don't know. It's interesting.
It feels like you guys are moving faster than the Americans are with our own Civil War, which we still,
Yes.
hash out. So,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't live there. I'm not sure what it's like on the ground in Vietnam, I'm not
yeah.
sure.
Have you okay, so your parents divorced when you were 7, you
Hmm.
said?
Well, they split up when I was 7. It took a while for everything to be settled. It was a 2-year divorce, so it wasn't finalized till I was 9. But they
Mhm.
split up. To me, 7 is the key age because that's when my parents separated, and so that's when my parents were no longer living in the same house. And then I think it took 2 years for the whole thing to be settled because they my parents fought very hard over custody and property and things like that. It was tough.
Hmm. And you said that I read that you were with your father in
Hmm.
the end of their divorce.
Yes. Yeah. Which is kind of unusual at the time. In the 70s, it was unusual for the father to be given custody. And I feel bad about that sometimes because I don't know. Again, I can only guess, whether like racism played a part in it.
Mhm.
There's some things that are probably very specific to my mother and some things that may have been out of her control that might have had to do with, I don't know, sexism or racism or whatever. But here's my dad who is a very effective lawyer. My dad could out he actually was on the debate team at the University of Wisconsin. Had gold medals, and I would not want to go up against my dad in court. And if I ever wanted to argue with him, I better have my facts straight because he knew how to argue. So he was probably a pretty formidable opponent when it came to their divorce. And my mother, was an immigrant and had less of a command of the English language and definitely less of a command of the legal system. And then she also had very specific things like that. One way that she really had a strict way of raising my brother and me, and that probably was more Vietnamese, where she put a lot of emphasis on having me be her helper and just do a lot of work around the house versus kind of having what some might consider a more normal American childhood. And so I remember that my dad telling me that the judge was very affected by that. Like the custody battle was mostly about me because my brother was only about 2 years old. He was just a toddler at the time. It was really about like what they could see in terms of how I was being raised by the two of them or what their values were. So I think that's why my dad got custody mostly, is just that my mother was raising me very strictly in a more sheltered way, wanting me to be more of a helper, which is more traditional in the Vietnamese culture, to have the firstborn child be kind of like the parent's helper versus in America where you're so much more free to be a kid. And,
Mhm.
there's just far less hardship too. I mean, I don't blame my mother for that. Like, I understand where that
Mhm.
came from, but I think that all factored into my father having custody. But they fought over it for 2 years. My dad moved out first, then my mother had the house that I grew up in, and then when everything was settled, she moved out and he moved back in. And I never, I stayed in the house the whole time. So that was one piece of stability for us, is that we were never moved out of the house, but my dad and mom kind of went back and forth a little bit over that.
Did they ever become amicable?
Oh yeah, they did actually. They really did. And I'm grateful for that because they had a very volatile marriage. But they did become amicable. I think they could see from a distance, which I think is true of a lot of couples that split up. You can see from a distance the good things that you saw about each other, and so they did become friendly, I would say. Over time. Like, I'm thinking about like high points, like when my son was born, they came together and they both my dad went and picked her up to go to my high school graduation and things like that. So they did become amicable. I mean, I wouldn't say they would ever go out for a beer or anything, but as good as it could be, I suppose.
Did either one ever remarry?
No, no, that's interesting. Yeah, they both dated, but and they had, especially my father had, a couple serious girlfriends, but neither one of them ever remarried.
Hmm.
Did they both stay in the Silver Springs area?
Yeah, Silver Spring. Yeah, that's where my mother still lives. So yeah, I grew up in College Park, Maryland. My dad was in the house that I grew up in until he died. So he
Hmm.
was stayed in College Park, and then my mother had stayed in a couple of different apartments before she bought her townhouse in Silver Spring, and that's where she still is.
Um, so so you spent most of your late childhood with your dad.
Hmm.
Did you and I know that you became estranged from your mother at a certain point.
Hmm.
Did Was that kind of like a teenager thing or
Yeah, so the main reason my parents split up is that my mother, like my father's mother, actually, has undiagnosed mental illness, and
Hmm.
I have tried to amateur diagnose her, but it's kind of dangerous to do that. So, um, when I have distance from that relationship, I feel a lot of compassion towards her because I think we often hear about the refugee experience and how traumatic that is, to have to pick up whatever you have and whatever you can carry and leave your country, your homeland. That's traumatic. And there's been lots of studies, and I hope there'll be lots more about the trauma that refugees go through. But I think there's, depending on the particular circumstances, I think leaving home can feel traumatic for a lot of people. And so when I have distance from the sort of emotional particulars of my relationship with my mother, I feel a lot of compassion towards her because she was burdened with a lot.
Mhm.
She had a sibling die when she was a half sibling die when she was young, and that was very traumatic for her. She did have a father that left the family. She went through a lot, and then she was kind of on this track, maybe more than she could handle, to like be successful and leave her house. Like that was an expectation, and then to marry somebody and completely uproot yourself and have to like, sort of dampen down who you are. Like I think my mother in particular just was not someone that handled that psychologically very well. And I think it was highly traumatizing for her. So when I have distance from it, I feel a lot of compassion towards her. But in reality, it's a hard personality to deal with. And it was hard for my dad because she would just, sort of, it was, something similar to like kind of having lots of highs and lows. And it was a
Mhm.
tumultuous time to be around her sometimes. So, um, my dad found that challenging to be married to, and I found it challenging to be the daughter of. And she just had a hard time sort of dealing with difficulties in relationships. So it was very all or nothing for her. So like if we weren't getting along, it was like we can't talk. So that began. We've had like serial estrangement since I was a teenager, and it continues like off and on to this day. Actually, and it'll probably always be that way. And it's unfortunate. It's a sad part of my life, but it's kind of like my story to deal with, as I keep going through all this.
Yeah. Everything's, everybody has their own normal,
That's right.
um, which is weird to, you know what I mean? Like somebody thinks it's different. You know what I mean? Like we're all just trying to get along
Yeah.
and protect ourselves, like our core being, from things. So I understand that like taking time away probably
Oh
is
yeah.
important.
I am all for self-protection when you need it. So
Yeah. But I mean, also, I mean, you talk about your mother's experiences and take any one of those things, like losing your father or a sibling, and that would, set people off on a trajectory that would be hard, to deal
yeah.
with.
And I just don't feel like there was support when she was younger, like, or there was as deep an understanding of mental illness and what people need. And now she's older and she's in a phase where she's a little bit more stubborn and it's harder to reach her. It's
Mhm.
now is not the time to sort of address that. That time probably was 50 years ago. And it's just an unfortunate fact of her life that I feel like, certain things she's just never been able to deal with. And I feel bad about that, and so a lot of, my research into the Vietnamese community and my own heritage is like my way of healing myself through all that, like really, just to sort of reconcile all that stuff, in a way that I can sit with, as an
Mhm.
adult and be okay with going forward.
Mhm.
Kim, you
But so
mentioned
when
that.
oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
No, you go ahead, Emily.
Well, you mentioned the Eden Center, and I just wondered if that was an important part of your life growing up, or when you first discovered it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the main way my mother and I have connected since I was born is through food. And, whenever we've had bad times together, like food is usually the thing that brings us back together. And I'm grateful for that. So, if you know the story, the first, place of development of commercial success for the Vietnamese community in Northern Virginia, in Arlington, was in the Clarendon neighborhood, which used to be known as Little Saigon. But that didn't last for very long because the metro system, the DC metro system, was being constructed through there. And basically, when the metro system was finished, the landlords were raising the rents on the shopkeepers there, the Vietnamese shops and stores and restaurants. And a group of them started the Eden Center in the early 80s. I think it opened in 1984. And this all happened, while we were living in Maryland, which to me, like all this stuff in Virginia felt like a world away. But my mother got wind of it, and basically as soon as there was a Little Saigon in Clarendon, we would go there. And as soon as Eden Center started, we would go there. And it was a like all day affair, and I loved it. Like that was a very important part of my upbringing, and especially a great way for me to sort of relish my mother's Vietnamese-ness and my own, although I wasn't old enough to sort of say it in those terms or understand that really. But I just loved those days in Clarendon and then in the Eden Center. And we still go to the Eden Center when we're getting along. Like when we're sort of together, we still go to the Eden Center. And it's still a place I go on my own all the time. It's an interesting place. It feels like its own little world. you really can feel immersed in Vietnamese culture and food there. And I hear this language that I can't understand. And that's how it was when my mother would, the few times she would speak Vietnamese when I was growing up, like say if she was talking to her sister or brother or to some friend, you know, Vietnamese friend, I would love to listen to her speak Vietnamese because it's a very like sing-songy kind of language. And I would have no idea what she was saying, but I just loved listening to it. And the only place I can get that now, you know, really is when I go to the Eden Center. So if I go there, I hear all these people speaking this language and it just makes me remember like my childhood a little bit. And it's very fun for me and feels really comforting.
Mhm.
Did you you came up with several projects outside of like studying in well as a part of studying the Eden Center. You wrote a book, The Saving Grace of Spring Rolls, and then there was the Echoes of Little Saigon Oral History Project. Um, were you surprised that there was like such interest to kind of save that history and that you were able to do those things?
Yeah, I didn't write a book called The Saving Grace of Spring Rolls. That was a book project that I was working on,
Oh,
and I may still yet finish, but I have given that name to essays I've written.
mhm.
And it's sort of like how I think about it's kind of how I think about my story. So if I ever do finish that book, that will probably be the title. But it so my first sort of foray to go back to Little Saigon, if you will, happened when I was in graduate school at Goucher College in the early 2000s. I was studying historic preservation. I have a master's degree in historic preservation, and um, honestly, this sounds so like kind of mercenary, but like there was a prize. They gave a prize, a monetary prize for the person that wrote the preservation paper that had to do with diversity and preservation and diversity in history and underrepresented voices. And so I was like, oh, I want that because I want some money because this is grad school and it's expensive. So it was kind of a not a super deep or meaningful reason why I decided to write about Little Saigon, but I was thinking about what might fit that bill, and I remembered Little Saigon, and by then I had moved to Arlington, and so I was in Clarendon all the time and had seen how much it had changed since I was little. And I remember feeling like nobody has documented this. I don't want to say nobody. I mean, it had been written up here and there. And certainly people were writing about Little Saigon in the 70s during its heyday, but not since, like not kind of a looking back, kind of with some distance and perspective. And so I embarked on that as a paper. It just started as a paper for my graduate program. Luckily, I did end up winning that prize, which was great. But little did I know that that would sort of just like sort of crack me open for like wanting to embrace studying this more and really taking this on. Like it began as an academic exercise and then it became something that I've sort of hung on to ever since. Like that, I think I wrote that paper in 2003 and here we are like over 20 years later and I'm still thinking about it and talking about it and doing stuff related to it and giving talks and you know, so I just had no idea that sort of going back to this place that had meant something to me when I was a kid would be so important to me as an adult, you know, sort of personally and professionally. Like professionally, it's given me a lot of neat opportunities like that booklet Echoes of Little Saigon and, you know, other things. I regularly give a walking tour in Arlington, in Clarendon, about once a year, sometimes twice a year, of the former Little Saigon in Clarendon. They're very popular. I'm doing it again this May, and it's become just a little cottage industry for me to do these walking tours. And um, I don't know, it's just a happy connections. It's nice to have happy connections to these places, places that, you know, to see people show interest in this history that I think means a lot to the area, but means a lot to me too personally.
Yeah. It's wonderful where when it comes together like that, the personal and the professional.
Yes.
How did your mom react to your work?
I think she's found it mildly interesting. I don't know whether it's intentional or not on her part, but she just doesn't like to look back very much and talk about it. So she doesn't engage very deeply, honestly, in the work that I do. It's really my thing, you know,
Mhm.
and she's sort of mildly interested in it. And you know, that's about it. So one thing that's kind of interesting though, I guess the Echoes of Little Saigon booklet is a 28 page booklet, illustrated booklet about the history of Little Saigon. You know, I took it very seriously, but it's not like sort of a huge, long academic scholarly work. It's meant as an accessible piece of, you know, literature for people who are interested. So someone could pick it up who could be a visitor to Arlington, or maybe, only lives here a couple years, and just learn a little bit about their history. It's supposed to be very accessible. And it was published in 2016. It was a partnership between Arlington County government and its historic preservation and cultural affairs departments, and what was then called the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, now just Virginia Humanities. And I'm always amazed that people are still interested in it. Like, so, it's just like it still has life. But one interesting thing that I thought was very sweet on my mother's part is that she was still working at the Library of Congress. And because this was basically like, a grant project that was published by a government, and a foundation, it wouldn't automatically become a library cataloged thing, for the Library of Congress. It would have to be something that was submitted for the library, like books, things that have an, as like ISBN number and things like that might be automatically triggered to be cataloged in the Library of Congress. But this little booklet was not. And my mother actually made a point to get my booklet into the Library of Congress, which I thought was a really sweet gift on her
Yeah.
part. So that was pretty cool. So
It is. It's a great booklet, and I used it for the exhibit.
oh,
So
wonderful.
I
I'm glad
yeah.
it's had an amazing life. And I always, I teach writing to students for Johns Hopkins, and I always say, like, just never know. Like, writing is like sending like a boomerang out into the world and seeing what comes back to you, because you just don't know how it's going to affect people, or what kind of life something is going to have. So I'm really proud of that booklet. I'm especially proud of its longevity, because I thought, oh, it's a little booklet. This is great. But people are still really interested in it. My walking tours are always sold out every year. I'm thinking, surely I've said this story to everybody in Arlington by now, but but people still are interested in it. So that does give me a lot of, satisfaction.
And
Yeah,
the
that's
design
awesome.
is beautiful of the book.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, it is. And that was a New York Times, a Vietnamese American New York Times graphic designer that did that. And we were so lucky to get him, because he was and is just incredibly talented.
Now, Kim,
Yeah.
you said you have children,
Yes.
and have you been trying to pass down Vietnamese American traditions
To the extent
as
that
much as you
I
can?
know them. Yeah, it's interesting because of my work, they know more about their Vietnamese heritage than I did growing up when I was their age. So I do think that's one thing that, and they're more distant from it. They have one Vietnamese grandmother now, whereas, that was my mother. So it's like, I feel like they're even more sort of distant from that story. But they know more about it. And it's important to me that they understand where they came from, and, that this is part of their lives and was part of my life, so they are aware. They're teenagers now, so they have their own interests, but it's, they
Mhm.
definitely are aware of their heritage, and they know they've been eating pho since they were little, and
Mhm.
all the other things, like, and they really appreciate that part.
Have you considered taking a family trip to Vietnam?
I have, actually. For many years I wanted to do it with my mother,
Mhm.
and so I have never been there. But she was adamant that she would never go back there. There's just so many hard feelings. And, for someone, there are many former South Vietnamese that don't feel this way. I know a lot of people have made pilgrimages back home, and it's been really healing and wonderful. But for my mother, it's a place that makes her sad. And she told me that finally, definitively, I'd sort of been working on her and working on her. Let's go to Vietnam. Let's go to Vietnam. And she finally said, no, I am never going back there. Like, it's too sad. Like, it's too
Mhm.
sad. So I dropped it. So I said, fine, I'm going to have to go on my own. And then I was all set to go to Vietnam on a trip in November of 2020. And then COVID happened, and that canceled that trip. I was finally going to go. I was going to make my pilgrimage to, the motherland, so to speak. And then, just for a variety of many reasons, I have not rebooked that trip since. I would like to go someday, and it would be
Mhm.
great to go with my kids, but it hasn't happened yet. So
Mhm.
I hope you
Yeah.
get to go soon.
me too.
Um, do you, in your, kind of as a child of a Vietnam era marriage between an American and a Vietnamese, do you have any feelings about the biggest misconceptions about the Vietnam War? Like, what you think the American people might misconceive about it?
Hmm. Well, that's a tough question. I mean, honestly, I can't say I've really thought about that very much, to be totally honest with you. I don't know. I do think that there were so many negative feelings about how protracted the U.S. involvement was in the war, and I do, as a lot of people have talked about, I do wish that our troops were treated better when they were returned. I know it was hard for my dad, and it took a long time for him to sort of talk about his wartime service, because I think that the environment was so negative about it, and the death toll had been so high. And my dad, he supported the military and he appreciated the military, but he also, like, I wouldn't say he was like super like rah rah military either. Like, he just went into civilian life and that focused on that. But it was very important for him to go down to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial every year on Veterans Day and be there
Mhm.
with all the other veterans. And he would wear his old army jacket, which I have now. And he did show me like all his patches and medals and things, and I have all of those things now. And so, I don't know if that has to do with misconceptions or anything, but like, it was important for my dad to always recall that time, and he always recalled it with deep feeling and pride. And, I think maybe he wished that other people felt more, proud of what we were trying to do there. And maybe that's happened over time, but
Well, I think definitely people are seeing, like with Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq, that getting out of a war is not an easy um, kind of exercise,
right.
and um, it's not always like World War II where you leave a clear victor, and
That's right.
and so
Yeah, with a big ticker tape parade and down Park Avenue or whatever it was. So, like, yeah, it doesn't happen that way. Sometimes it's a lot of quiet homecomings and then a lot of struggle in the aftermath. I definitely think that my family is, an example of just one of, just countless families that the war just kind of sort of wreaking havoc on my family
Mhm.
in ways you couldn't predict for a long time. I think if they were two different people, maybe their marriage could have survived, but in a way, it's doesn't totally surprise me that their marriage didn't survive because it was sort of came about in this very fraught time period. My dad had just suffered the loss of his father. My mother, had to leave home and felt all this responsibility. And life is hard. So
Yeah, it seems like from the military people that we've spoken to that they kind of, it reverberates through their life, and it affected their relationships at home and with their family members. So
yeah, I think that's true. I don't think that's as true for my family specifically, only because my dad wasn't there for very long, and he was lucky that, in a way, because he was there on the early side of the war, of the deep U.S. involvement. He was not there when so many boots were on the ground and so many deaths, which happened a little bit later in the '60s. He was out of it by then. He
yeah,
might have felt some guilt over that. I don't know. But he was relatively lucky and he worked in intelligence, so there's a little bit of a remove there. He was creating, reports and gathering information that supported troops on the ground. So he had a little distance, which I think was probably protective for him in terms of the trauma of war, thankfully. But he did carry a lot of issues too. My father was a highly anxious person. He had anxiety. He struggled with anxiety his whole life, and he actually had a heart attack. He passed away from a heart attack suddenly in 2010, and I'll never know like how much stress he carried and whether that really, who knows how that might have affected his health over the long term. But he died at 68. He didn't get to live a super long life, so it's hard
mhm,
to say, like with those little reverberations like you said.
mhm. Um, is there anything about the Vietnam War or Little Saigon or the Eden Center that we haven't asked you about that you would wish that we would ask you about?
Hmm. There's something I talk about in my walking tours that is a relatively new development. And one of the great benefits of thinking about something for a long time is that, like, still new things will come to you, if you give enough thought to it. So, years ago, when I started writing about Little Saigon and giving these walking tours of the former Little Saigon, I really love to talk up how wonderful Arlington was. And maybe that's just because I love living in Arlington, and it is a very progressive, welcoming, sparkly place to live. It's just always been fun to live here, and I love Arlington. But I used to always frame it as that how lucky it was that these refugees, these immigrants were able to set up this short-lived community in this county that was overall relatively welcoming to them. The county did pivot in several key ways to support the newcomers, the Vietnam refugees. They developed, school programs and, translation services and life skills services. A bunch of things happened in the wake of this influx from Vietnam in Arlington. It was kind of like a perfect place, really, because there was such welcoming people here to pivot and support them. So I used to really focus on how great for the refugees was the fact that they were here in this progressive area that was supportive of them, generally speaking. But I've kind of changed how I talk about that recently, because the more I think about it, the more I think about what the Vietnamese refugees did for this community, like they do for so many communities. The Clarendon area of Arlington had been completely, on its downhill. Like, they had torn up the streets to build this metro station. It had been the downtown mecca, shopping mecca in the 50s. And then by the 60s and 70s, when they were building suburban malls, like basically shopping in Clarendon was dead. And so I realized that the influx of Vietnamese refugees allowed Arlington to see what Clarendon could be. They like revitalized this area and gave it life and community and a tax base and income and commerce and all these things, when that was not happening to a large degree in Clarendon. And they were like, wringing their hands over it, county officials. And so I like to talk now about and really emphasize what the refugees and immigrants did for this community, like how important it was for them to give all that to the community, and that we really owe them a debt of gratitude in Arlington, for doing that, for like really revitalizing this area. It isn't just about what the county gave them, it's about what they gave to their community, and really allowed the community to see it as this vibrant, living place that could thrive. And it's incredible that they were able to do that, with having just left home and having just left this war zone. So I really credit them for that, and I really like to emphasize that now.
Mm-hmm.
That's really well said. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Did the group, after they left Little Saigon, did they ever like organize into like a Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce or something? I don't know what you call the shop, because I mean they all went to the Eden Center together. Have they ever like organized?
Not to the extent that I have been able to find that out. And actually, what's interesting is that the Eden Center is now owned by like a real estate company. It's like a properties company, a property manager named, I think, oh, I'm not going to guess the name. I don't remember the name. Capital something. Anyway, the Eden Center is owned by like a property manager now, and that was a deliberate decision because at a certain point that I'm not super clear on, the business owners in Eden Center realized that sort of managing the big property was almost too much for them. They really wanted to focus on running their businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they chose a partner that's been a partner for them for, a property manager partner for decades now. And he's very pro Vietnamese, very pro community. They feel like it's a very strong supporter. So that's worked out really well for them. But I haven't heard of sort of any other kind of organizing. There are certainly associations of Vietnamese Americans and different, sort of social groups or heritage groups and things like that, that have developed since in the last few decades. But I don't know if there's a particular thing that has to do with business development, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay. Did you get a feeling, did your dad ever talk about how he felt about the fall of Saigon? I know it was like such an important day for your mom, and then having your brother, like that was like a big day and a lot of feelings. But did your dad have any feelings?
Not that I recall him. I mean, I'm certain that he did have feelings. Like, I'm positive. How could he have been there to support the South Vietnamese war effort, and our interests there without sort of feelings when that side was defeated? I feel certain that he felt strongly about it, but I don't remember having any super deep conversations with him about it. And he was, unlike my mother, someone that did like to talk about the past. He did like to talk about the past and talk about history and his place in it. He was always very aware of kind of how he was intersecting with with world events, like he was always interested in international relations and things like that. So if he had strong feelings about it, I feel like I would have heard about it over the years. So I think it was just something that happened that he felt sad about, but I don't think it affected him deeply personally.
Hmm.
Do
Okay.
you ever attend any of the commemoration ceremonies about the fall of Saigon?
I haven't, outside of right here in Northern Virginia. Like I've been involved
Um,
in like some commemoration activities over the years that I've helped to actually put on. So I've been
uh-huh.
involved in some of that, and I know that next year, obviously, with the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, like I hope to have this, a lot of participation, a lot of chance to think about this. So because it was really life changing for so many people.
Hmm. What kind of events do have they typically had that you've been involved in?
Well, I've been to a couple of like conferences where there were speakers talking about memories. I know I was in one. This is many years ago, but there was one event I was in that was really focused on the last flight out of Vietnam,
Mm.
and the people that got on the last flight. And I was just someone that was helping put that event on. That happened in Arlington. For the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon in Arlington, we had a bunch of speakers. And one thing that was really neat is that we worked with an artist who recreated a 3D art, like 3D art that kind of recreated what Little Saigon looked like in the
Huh.
late 70s. And that was on display in the center of what's now the Clarendon Metro Plaza. It's great because the
Mhm.
Clarendon Metro, which was sort of the reason behind the fall of Little Saigon, but there's now this wonderful plaza that's almost like a fantastic civic space around the metro. So it's just funny how things come full circle, because when I start and end my walking tours on the Clarendon Metro Plaza, because that's where I
Hmm.
have a space to stand in a circle and talk about this stuff, and it really is right where all this stuff started to happen. So and I'm sure that there'll be some interesting things happening in Clarendon and possibly Eden Center too next year.
Mhm. I know. I want to go on your walking tour. So
Oh,
reserve a ticket for me, please.
I will. May 4th. May 4th is, which I'm also a geek, so that's Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with
Yeah.
you. So May 4th. Yeah, definitely let me know.
Okay.